Bullets ripped through the entrance of the Whitaker family home. 2 family members died instantly, while 1 survivor clutched a bleeding chest wound. But the gunman never... The Whitakers had just returned to Oyster Creek Drive after celebrating their son's graduation. They expected a peaceful Sugarland evening before... It was the night of December 10th, 2003. Sugarland, Texas, was the embodiment of the American dream, a manicured suburb of Houston where high-achieving families built their legacy. Kent and Tricia Whitaker were the prototypical success story of this affluent enclave. Kent was a high-level tax accountant and construction operations manager, while Tricia, known to everyone as Tricia, was a retired elementary school teacher with a compassionate heart. On this particular Wednesday, the family was in exceptionally high spirits. They had just finished a celebratory dinner at Pappasito's Cantina to honor their eldest son, Bart. After years of study, Bart was finally graduating from Sam Houston State University. His parents were so proud they had already given him a luxury Rolex watch as a graduation gift, which he wore on his wrist as they joked and laughed during the short drive home. The family arrived at their residence in the 1100 block of Oyster Creek Drive around 8:20 p.m. Kevin, their 19-year-old son and a bright sophomore at Baylor University, led the way inside. The house was dark, but he didn't hesitate to step across the threshold. However, as Kevin moved into the foyer, a figure emerged from the shadows near the stairs. A masked shooter, waiting in the gloom, opened fire without a word. Kevin was struck in the chest and collapsed instantly. Tricia was only steps behind him. As she entered the hallway, the gunman fired again. The bullet tore through her chest, and she fell beside her son, her final sight being the incomprehensible violence unfolding in her own home. Kent followed next, feeling a sudden, bone-jarring impact as a third bullet struck his shoulder and narrowly missed his heart. He slumped against the doorframe, gasping for air as the shooter turned the gun on Bart. In a desperate scramble, Bart appeared to grapple with the intruder and was shot in the arm before the gunman fled through the back of the house. Blood pooled on the polished floors of the perfect home. But there was one detail. The 1100 block of Oyster Creek Drive represented the peak of the American dream in the early 2000s. Located in the affluent, low-crime suburb of Sugarland, Texas, the Whitaker home was a place of order and achievement. Kent Whitaker was a man of precision, a successful tax accountant and construction operations manager who balanced professional rigor with a deep commitment to his family and their local church. His wife, Tricia, known as Tricia to her friends, was a retired elementary school teacher who filled their home with the warmth of a life spent serving others. Together, they had raised 2 sons in an environment of privilege and high expectations. To their neighbors in Fort Bend County, the Whitakers were the definition of a perfect family. Their youngest son, Kevin, was a 19-year-old sophomore at Baylor University with a bright future ahead of him. But that night, the spotlight was on the eldest son, Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, known to everyone as Bart. The evening of December 10th, 2003, was supposed to be a milestone celebration. Bart had convinced his parents he was graduating from Sam Houston State University, a significant achievement they were eager to honor. The family gathered at Pappasito's Cantina for a celebratory dinner, where the air was thick with pride and laughter. During the meal, Kent and Tricia presented Bart with a graduation gift that symbolized his transition into the professional world, a luxury Rolex watch. Bart accepted the gift with a practiced smile, thanking his parents for their support and discussing his transition into adulthood. He played the part of the successful graduate with chilling accuracy. In reality, the entire celebration was built on a foundation of lies. Bart was not graduating. He was not even enrolled in classes. He had dropped out of the university years prior after a string of academic failures. But one detail didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. Bart had spent months carefully curating this double life. He had forged transcripts and maintained a grueling schedule of deception to keep his parents from discovering his academic collapse. For Bart, the pressure of maintaining the family's high status had become an unbearable weight. To Kent and Tricia, an academic struggle would have been a disappointment to be managed with love, but to Bart, it was a catastrophe that required. As the family left the restaurant and drove toward their home on Oyster Creek Drive, the Rolex on Bart's wrist ticked away the final moments of his parents' lives. He knew the graduation ceremony he had promised them was never going to happen. He knew that the lie would eventually be exposed. In his narcissistic worldview, the only way to retain control was to ensure there was no one left to witness his failure. The suburban piece of Sugarland was about to be shattered by a darkness that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He had even planned the exact moment the burglary would begin. The Sugarland Police Department detectives were seasoned professionals, but the atmosphere at the crime scene on Oyster Creek Drive felt wrong. As they processed the blood-spattered entryway where Kevin and Patricia had fallen, Bart Whitaker was remarkably articulate for someone who had just watched his family be butchered. While his father, Kent, was fighting for every breath in a surgical suite at Memorial Hermann Hospital, Bart remained eerily composed. He spoke of a masked intruder and a frantic struggle, but his wounds were superficial, almost textbook in their placement. But one missing item from the crime scene pointed to an inside job. A common thief would have taken the expensive Rolex watch Bart had received earlier that night, yet it remained untouched on his wrist. This small inconsistency led investigators to dig into the very foundation of Bart's life. They contacted Sam Houston State University to verify the graduation he had just celebrated with a high-end steak dinner at Pappasito's Cantina. The response from the registrar was chilling. Bart Whitaker was not a student at the university. He had been dismissed for academic reasons years prior, yet he had continued to lie to his parents for semesters, collecting thousands of dollars for tuition and books that were never purchased. The facade of the successful, driven son was vaporizing before their eyes. Then, the investigation shifted from a local robbery gone wrong to a premeditated assassination plot. An old acquaintance named Rudy Cyback contacted the authorities with a haunting story. He claimed that in 2000 and 2001, Bart had tried to recruit him to murder the Whitaker family for their estate. Cyback provided names and dates of failed attempts, describing a previous plot involving the family's lake house that fell through only because the recruited gunman lost his nerve. But what investigators discovered next in Bart's secret communication, they realized this wasn't just a disgruntled son, it was a calculating strategist who had. The alibi was gone, replaced by the dark realization that the shooter, Chris Brass here, wasn't a random burglar, but a roommate acting on Bart's precise orders to ensure no one left that house alive. While Kent Whitaker lay in a hospital bed praying for his son's safety, the son was already scouting his exit strategy. By June 2004, the local Sugarland investigators had moved past the theory of a random burglary. The inconsistencies in Bart's story were too glaring to ignore. He had never graduated from Sam Houston State University. He had never even been enrolled for the semester he claimed to be finishing. The gold Rolex sitting in his drawer was a symbol of a life built on mirrors and smoke, a gift for a milestone that did not exist. When a grand jury was eventually convened and the pressure became a physical weight, Bart Whitaker did what he had always done when faced with the consequences of his own actions. He ran. He did not just cross county lines, he abandoned his country entirely, fleeing across the southern border into the heart of Mexico. For the next 15 months, the trail went cold, leaving his grieving father to wonder if he had truly lost his only remaining family member to the same shadows that had claimed his wife and youngest son. In the small, sun-bleached town of Cerralvo, Bart did not hide in a cellar. Instead, he reinvented himself with a chilling ease that suggested he had been practicing for this his entire life. He adopted the name Rudy Rios, claiming he was a wayward American looking for a fresh start after a troubled past. He learned the local dialect, found steady work at a community furniture shop, and even began dating, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of a town that had no idea a suspected killer was in its midst. It was a life built on a stolen identity, a quiet existence far from the million-dollar inheritance he had orchestrated a massacre to secure. Back in Texas, however, the hunt never truly stopped. Law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly with Mexican authorities, tracking leads through the complex underworld of identity theft and cross-border movement, until a tip finally narrowed the search to the dusty streets of Cerralvo. In September 2005, the charade of Rudy Rios came to a definitive halt. Mexican officials apprehended Bart and transported him to the Laredo border crossing, where he was turned over to waiting American authorities. As the steel handcuffs clicked shut on his wrists, the young man who had once stood over his dying mother's body was finally forced to face the reality of high-stakes justice. The image of Bart being led back into Texas, his hair longer, his skin tanned from the Mexican sun, and his expression eerily vacant, became a haunting fixture on the evening news. To the neighbors back on Oyster Creek Drive, the perfect son was now a stranger in chains. But as the legal system prepared for one of the most emotional capital murder trials in the state's history, the focus shifted from his flight to the motive that drove a son to orchestrate the execution of his own flesh and blood was as hot. Bart Whitaker didn't just want the $1.5 million estate. He wanted the freedom of wealth without the burden of his family's expectations. On that final night at Pappasito's Cantina, he had looked his father in the eye and accepted a Rolex watch, a gift for a degree he hadn't earned. It was a trophy for a life he was about to steal. While Chris Brazier received life in prison and Steve Champagne was handed a 15-year sentence for his role as the driver, the state of Texas reserved its ultimate punishment for the mastermind. In 2007, Bart was sentenced to die by lethal injection. But as the years on death row passed, an extraordinary shift began to occur within the walls of Kent Whitaker. Despite the bullet that had narrowly missed his heart and the crushing loss of his wife and younger son, chose a path that baffled the American legal system. He became his son's fiercest advocate, arguing that the state had no right to take his last remaining family member in the name. As February 22, 2018 dawned, Bart Whitaker was moved to a small cell mere feet from the execution chamber in Huntsville. His final meal had been requested and the IV lines were being prepared. Kent Whitaker made one last desperate plea to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, standing as a living testament to the complexity of shit. In a move that sent shockwaves through the country, the board issued a unanimous recommendation for clemency. Less than an hour before the chemicals were to flow, Governor Greg Abbott signed the papers to commute Bart's sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the first time in Texas history that a death sentence was halted specifically. Bart will spend the rest of his days behind bars, a living shadow of the family he tried to erase, kept alive only by the mercy of the man he tried to kill. Does a victim's desire for mercy outweigh the state? If this story of betrayal and radical forgiveness gave you chills, hit subscribe and the notification. Drop your theory in the comments below.